April 1945. A wooded ravine near the Ohrdruf concentration camp. A cold spring breeze rattles the bare branches above a long trench. The ground here is freshly disturbed. A thin layer of dark dirt barely covers the gray skin and starved limbs of dozens of murdered prisoners thrown into the pit like trash. Several well-dressed Germantown councilmen stand on the muddy ridge. They pinch their noses. They turn their heads away from the trench. One man, wearing a heavy fur coat, dabs a silk handkerchief against his lip, complaining loudly about the stench. He demands an immediate escort back to his comfortable villa. He claims cultured citizens should not have to look at such ugly things. He insists he knew nothing about the executions. General Patton will soon hear this defense, and he will ensure these leaders face the foulest reality of the war. This is the story of how General George Patton forced arrogant Germantown officials to dig into a mass grave with their bare hands. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show the moments that forced people to face what they had done. Captain Louis Gable was 29 years old. He came from a crowded, working-class immigrant neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. He was a battle-tested officer in the 4th Armored Division. Before the war, he worked long hours in a steel mill to support his aging parents. He enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor because he believed in drawing a clear line between right and wrong. He had seen fierce combat across France and Belgium, losing his best friend to an artillery blast during the Battle of the Bulge. That loss left him with a quiet, hardened determination. He had survived the worst of the front lines, but nothing prepared him for what he witnessed in the wooded ravine outside Ohrdruf. He had spent the entire morning documenting the starved, skeletal remains of the camp prisoners. His eyes were hollow, and his grease-stained uniform was heavily caked in the foul, damp dirt of the mass grave. Herr Friedrich Hoffmann was 50 years old. He was the prominent head of the local town council and a wealthy banker who had lived his entire life in luxury. For years, Hoffmann had quietly used his massive financial influence to fund the regional Nazi party, ensuring his own businesses prospered under the regime. He believed that ordinary citizens like himself were entirely separate from the violence of the state. He stood on the edge of the pit, wearing a heavy, expensive fur coat to shield himself from the sharp spring chill. He repeatedly pressed a monogrammed silk handkerchief over his nose to block the odor. He loudly declared that he was a highly cultured man who could not be expected to look at such gruesome sights. He claimed absolute ignorance of the executions, insisting the SS had operated entirely without the knowledge of the town. He stood there, clean and detached, demanding that the American soldiers immediately return him to his comfortable, untouched estate. The Allied advance across Western Europe was accelerating at a staggering pace during the final weeks of the war. Armored columns shattered the remaining German defensive lines, pushing deep into the heart of the collapsing regime. As the front line pushed forward, American combat units rapidly outran their established supply lines, creating massive logistical hurdles. The local civilian administrations were thoroughly shattered, leaving behind a chaotic vacuum of authority and ruined infrastructure. Entire towns were left completely isolated, cut off from basic utilities, fuel, and food distribution networks. Amidst this widespread devastation, frontline troops began stumbling directly into hidden networks of camps, exposing a vast system of state-sponsored brutality that many field commanders had never anticipated. Many American military officers, overwhelmed by the sheer speed of the advance and the immediate demands of tactical governance, frequently chose to overlook the passive cooperation of local civilian authorities. They prioritized restoring basic order, clearing blocked roads, and securing critical municipal infrastructure over investigating the political histories of small-town mayors and prominent regional businessmen. War-weary commanders often accepted superficial declarations of ignorance from respectable local leaders simply to keep the municipal machinery moving forward. They needed functional administrative structures to manage the vast waves of displaced persons and refugees choking the local highways. This bureaucratic leniency allowed numerous wealthy facilitators of the regime to smoothly transition into cooperative partners for the occupation forces. maintaining their social status and unearned privileges behind a facade of sudden compliance. They believed their clean clothes and polished manners would insulate them from the consequences of the nearby horrors. But the temporary blind spot created by the rapid advance was about to vanish completely in the mud of the Ohrdruf ravine. Captain Gable stood on the muddy slope, staring at the town councilmen who had just arrived from their warm houses. He pointed toward the long, open trench where the bodies lay packed together under the thin soil. He asked Herr Hoffmann to look into the ravine and explain what had happened to these men. Hoffmann adjusted the collar of his expensive fur coat, tapped his silk handkerchief against his nostrils, and stepped back toward the waiting vehicle. He told the captain that this was an administrative matter for the military authorities and had absolutely nothing to do with civil governance. Captain Gable stepped directly into Hoffmann's path, his boots sinking deep into the foul mire. He told the banker that the dead men in the trench were human beings murdered less than 48 hours ago. He stated that as head of the town council, Hoffmann was responsible for everything that occurred within his municipality. Hoffmann sneered, waving his hand toward the woods to dismiss the accusation. He replied that the camp was entirely under the jurisdiction of the SS, and a wealthy civilian banker had no authority over state security measures. The captain pulled a small leather ledger from his pocket and held it up. He informed Hoffmann that the division had already seized the bank records in town, showing years of consistent financial transfers from Hoffmann's personal accounts to the regional party headquarters. He told him the funding directly sustained the local guards who handled the executions. Hoffmann did not blink. He drew himself up to his full height and answered that business investments under the current laws were mandatory for survival. He added that cultured men of his social standing could not be held accountable for the administrative excess of soldiers, and he would not stand in the mud discussing state policy with a common laborer from Chicago. Captain Gable clenched his fists, watching his heavily armed men take a step forward, their faces dark with rage as they listened to the banker's defensive entitlement. He knew his men were seconds away from pulling their triggers right there on the ridge. He looked at Hoffmann's clean leather shoes, then down at the rotting hands breaking through the surface of the dirt. He told the council leader that this situation had completely bypassed standard civil discussion. He turned to his sergeant and ordered him to hold the councilman at gunpoint right on the edge of the pit while he made the radio call. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. His open-top jeep pulled up to the edge of the ravine, kicking up a spray of cold, gray mud. 4 silver stars gleamed on his helmet. 2 ivory-handled revolvers rested in the leather holsters at his hips. He stepped out of the vehicle and walked toward the ridge with slow, deliberate strides. His face was entirely frozen, his eyes scanning the open trench, then the armed guards, and finally the row of town officials standing at gunpoint. The general did not raise his voice. He did not wave his arms. The entire ridge fell completely silent as he approached. Patton stopped directly in front of the town council leader. He looked at the silk handkerchief, still clutched in the banker's hand. He asked Hoffmann if he found the air in the woods unpleasant. Hoffmann cleared his throat, dabbed his lip, and replied that the scent was indeed unbearable for men of refinement. Patton asked him if he knew how long the bodies had been resting in the dirt behind his town. Hoffmann shook his head, stating that the civil administration never received reports from the security zones. Patton asked if the local banks routinely processed transfers without knowing the identity of the recipients. Hoffmann looked at the ivory revolvers and answered that financial transactions were merely matters of ledger entries, not moral philosophy. "You think you are too cultured for this dirt," Patton said. His voice was like cracking ice. He looked down at the mud caked on Captain Gable's boots, then back at the spotless fur coat worn by the banker. He told Hoffmann that the men in the pit had been stripped of their clothes, their names, and their lives, while the town council accumulated interest on their suffering. He stated that a man who provides the wealth to build a slaughterhouse cannot claim his hands are clean simply because he hires someone else to handle the knives. He informed the German leaders that their education, their fine garments, and their social standing would no longer insulate them from the reality they had financed for 12 years. Patton pointed a gloved finger directly into the dark center of the open trench. He told Hoffman that he had two choices remaining on this ridge. He could either strip off his heavy coat, climb down into the foul mud, and begin digging out the dead with his own hands, or he could choose to face an immediate military tribunal for active complicity in mass execution. He gave the banker 10 seconds to make his decision. Hoffman looked at the hollow eyes of the American soldiers, looked back at the cold stare of the general, and slowly reached for the silver buttons of his fur coat. The armed guards stepped forward, their rifles slung but ready. As they stripped the expensive fur coats from the shoulders of Herr Hoffman and the other town councilmen, the heavy garments were thrown onto the damp leaves, followed immediately by the confiscation of their iron shovels. Patton watched in silence as the leaders were forced to descend directly into the mass grave, their polished leather shoes sliding down the slick, muddy slope of the ravine. The air was thick with the heavy stench of decaying flesh, making the men gag as their bare hands first broke through the thin crust of dirt. Hoffman retched violently, dropping to his knees in the mire, and begged the surrounding guards for a pair of work gloves. Patton drew his ivory-handled revolver, pointed it directly at the ground near the banker's feet, and told him he did not need gloves when he took their money. He ordered him to dig. The prominent town leaders spent the next several hours pulling the cold, skeletal remains of the prisoners from the mud, lifting them up the slippery incline one by one. A silent crowd of local civilians and hollow-eyed soldiers lined the ridge, watching the wealthy bankers labor until their manicured fingers bled, placing each victim carefully into an individual wooden coffin. Captain Louis Gable returned to the city of Chicago after his discharge from the military late in 1945. He never completely recovered from the physical or mental exhaustion he suffered during those final months in Europe. He went back to working at the local steel mill to help support his family. But his family noted that he remained unusually silent and rarely discussed the details of his service. He married a year later, raised 3 children in a small brick bungalow, and spent his weekends volunteering at a local community center. He kept a tiny piece of gray fabric from the Ohrdruf ravine tucked away inside his old footlocker for the rest of his life. Captain Gable passed away quietly at his home in the summer of 1983. Herr Friedrich Hoffmann spent 18 months inside an American internment camp awaiting formal judicial processing for his civilian financial activities during the regime. A regional denazification tribunal eventually confiscated more than half of his personal wealth, blocking him from ever reclaiming his prominent seat on the town council or his position at the bank. He retired to a small cottage on the outer edge of the municipality, living a deeply isolated life. The local townspeople largely avoided him, remembering the afternoon he had been forced into the mud. He died bitter and completely broke in the spring of 1957. General George Patton never included the specific encounter with the town councilmen in his official military logs or his subsequent public briefings. He did mention the afternoon briefly in a private letter addressed to his wife, noting that some men require a physical confrontation with dirt to comprehend the gravity of their choices. He wrote that an expensive coat provides no shelter when a man is forced to stand face to face with the results of his own greed. Some historians have argued that General Patton's decision to force local civilian leaders into the mass grave went far corporate military protocol and risked violating standard regulations regarding the treatment of non-combatants in occupied territories. These critics suggest that the public spectacle was driven more by personal theater than by a strict adherence to international legal framework. Other historians have argued the opposite, maintaining that the extreme nature of the camp discoveries required an unprecedented response to pierce the widespread denials of the civilian population. What is certain is that the confrontational method established an immediate precedent across the occupied zones, ensuring that local populations could never claim they were entirely unaware of the atrocities committed in their name. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have left the task of recovery to the military commission? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about the moments that forced people to face what they'd done, make sure to subscribe.